Hello, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us. I'm Jane Robertson and the Director of Communications for Frog Systems, and we build platforms that focus on the lived experience to help people with their mental health and well-being. Today, as you know, is International Men's Day, and to mark it, we're looking at the relationship between fatherhood and men's mental health. Fatherhood is a wonderful thing when it happens, yet in that moment, everything changes of becoming a parent, your relationships, your future, your responsibilities. We've been joined by three dads who are advocates for more support for men's positive mental health in fatherhood and a society in which all parents are given help and support. So let me welcome them. It's Mark Williams, who is an international campaigner on men's mental health, having suffered from poor mental health following a traumatic birth of his son. Mark has co-written reports for government, authored the book Daddy Blues, the film of which is being premiered in Leeds tonight, and he coaches health professionals on how to provide better antenatal and postnatal support for fathers. Jamie Cooke is a father of three who juggles fatherhood with running the Royal Society of Arts in Scotland and is a global campaigner for social justice and for a fairer and more inclusive society. And Kieron Achara is a former Olympic basketball player and dad of two. He's a busy broadcaster who has become a firm advocate for men's mental health awareness. He's also a sports consultant with us here at Frog Systems. Thank you all for joining us. Now, if any of you who've tuned in, if you have any questions while we're talking, please do drop them into the chat and we will try and answer as many of them as possible. So guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Perhaps before we get to the reality of fatherhood, I could just ask you all, what were your expectations of fatherhood and what did you base those expectations on? Perhaps I could start with you, Mark.
Yeah. I was 30 years of age. I thought I was fully prepared. Everything was right, work-wise and everything. But for me personally, after 22 hours labour and my wife having an emergency C-section, I actually had a panic attack. I've never had a panic attack like that. And I've worked in secure units since that time as well. I'm working in mental health, but, thinking your wife and baby is going to die in front of you as well in other areas. And then my wife, Michelle, went on to have severe postnatal depression, where we know now as PTSD, because it does overlap in the postnatal period or birth trauma. And then what I know now, the father's witnessing that trauma is PTSD is an anxiety disorder, the witnessing or experiencing a life-threatening event. So, the first year of fatherhood, nearly 17 years ago, where there was not really talk about mental health like it is now, I thought, I had all the thoughts and feelings mums get with postnatal depression as well, not good enough. I didn't initially bond with my son initially. I think that came eventually because I was home for 6 months. And we got to educate fathers about the importance of skin to skin, which actually releases oxytocin, which is good for dad and the baby as well. So my personality totally changed in the first year of fatherhood. And I'm lucky I got a lot of good friends and family around me. But for me personally, it was the loneliest time because I couldn't tell my wife how I was feeling because it didn't impact on her mental health, and certainly couldn't tell my friends. So unfortunately, I went down the more negative coping skills like alcohol to cope when my mind was racing. And not knowing I had an undiagnosed disorder called ADHD until I was 40. And then the lack of sleep, financial costs because I was home for 6 months. And then you're looking after your wife who was in crisis teams and all sorts of things. At a happiest time, unfortunately for me, during that first year, it wasn't as happy as a lot of fathers experience as well. But like I said, the high rates of depression in new fathers, and that's why we campaign, make sure all parents are supported for their mental health without never taking the attention away from mum ever. It's about supporting all parents because it can impact on mum's mental health and the development of the child as well.
That's a really, really difficult experience that you went through there, Mark, and it's wonderful to hear the sort of campaigning work that you do, and we'll come on to the sort of details of that a little bit later on. Jamie, you were busy running a big organisation. You've got three children. What were your expectations of fatherhood, if you can remember back to your first one?
Yeah, it was a wee while ago now. So I was 28 when we had our first, and actually it was just before I started at the RSA. I think I started there when Ben, my oldest, was just turning 1. I think I was really struck by the fact that, it's that cliche of you can't fully understand it till you do it. And actually, out of everything in my life, I think fatherhood's probably the biggest reality I've seen of that. I think I went into it with a lot of, as you touched on there, Mark, a lot of those ideas of how great it's going to be, the connections, the love, the joy, all of which, I was very lucky to have there. And I certainly had an easier experience than you did, Mark, in that sense. But also the kind of exhaustion, the fear, the impacts around the responsibilities you feel you have. I've always prided myself on being a very liberal, kind of laid back kind of guy. I never knew I had deeply ingrained presumptions around kind of gender roles till I was put into that position where suddenly I was the dad. And, as you said, Mark, you can't tell people if you're struggling or it's difficult, because your job's to be stoic and, strong throughout it all. And I think it is that combination of so many different powerful feelings all hitting at once that it's quite overwhelming in terms of jumping between, as I say, joy to pride to fear to back to joy to exhaustion to everything else. And I think balancing that then with everything else has been a huge challenge throughout that time, and with subsequent children. It's different each time, and yet it carries additional challenges with it. I think the final thing I would say is it's been really fascinating for me, given that I suppose comparatively speaking to most of my friend group, we had children or started having children earlier than they did. It's been very interesting seeing that experience perhaps for friends of mine who were having their first child when we were having our third. And, almost kind of stepping back from that and witnessing it as an outsider who's had that experience. You kind of want to support people. And I think this is where the work that Mark and Kieron are doing is so critical. And yet also you kind of see it as such a unique experience for each person that it's difficult in some ways to, you don't want to be one of those people that steps in and says, here's how you do it, or here's how your experience will be. So I would say I'm very much still learning, even now, as, with three children at a very different stage.
Yeah, mine are older teenagers, and I'm still learning every day, I have to say. So, Kieron, what about you? I mean, you came from a very kind of professional sports background. What were your expectations? I guess they must have been a bit different because you were, you had still had to go out and compete.
Yeah, I mean, my expectations, I was clearly really excited, and even thinking about my childhood, my father wasn't in my life from a young age, so I always had these kind of expectations of I want to be this great father and be there for my children and everything else. So I was really, really excited about the prospect. The only things that were conflicting was when our firstborn was due. It was going to be at the start of the season, and I hadn't signed my contract yet for the start of the season. So as a professional athlete, actually, it's quite funny. Well, it's not funny, but it's a part of the reality is you're even told when to schedule your kids. Try and have them in off season. So these are things that are talked about. And it actually does play in your mind because you are thinking about it from a performance perspective. When would be the best time? And obviously, science is science. A lot of these things cannot be planned to a T. So I was excited, but at the same time, there was a lot of mixed emotions because there was a lot of uncertainty. Would it stop me from getting a new job, which in turn I ended up doing? I don't know if we're talking about this later or should I talk about this now, Jane?
Yeah, no, feel free.
Yeah, so I had just finished my season, and the way I compare professional sports, especially in the basketball context, what I can relate to, it's like the gig economy. You're essentially self-employed, and you go on these small contracts, 8 to 10 months every single year. So that was actually seen as a hindrance. So my daughter was due at the start of the season. I was still looking to sign for clubs. Clubs were wanting me out for pre-season straight away. I wasn't willing to go out to pre-season because I wanted to be there for the birth of my daughter. So that actually cost me one of my jobs. And when my daughter was born, I was actually quote unquote unemployed. I didn't have a job. So actually, from there, I ended up starting reaching out to the club I knew close to me was the Glasgow Rocks because they were right on my doorstep. So that's essentially how I ended up signing and coming back to the UK, because I'd been turned down from work in Italy. I was essentially saying if I wasn't willing to come out, I was going to lose my contract, and that's exactly what they did. And to be fair, they actually contacted me after, apologised, asked me to then come back out. But the damage was done. I kind of understood where I stood as a player, I was seen as a commodity. It wasn't about what's going on in your life, what else could be going on, what else could be affecting your performance. It was all about, we need you now because this is how we win. So it was quite an interesting experience to start. Like I said, my expectations went from one of a real positivity to then actually a lot of uncertainty, because I just didn't know where I would be and how it would affect my performance on the court.
So that's a very good overview of the sort of expectations that you all had. And Mark, just sort of coming back to you to sort of shed a bit more light, and thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. I know you've talked a lot in TEDx and all sorts of speeches about this, but I'm just thinking back to being a sort of new mum, and I ended up going into an operating theatre, and I haven't even thought about the experience that my husband might have had, of seeing me in, having to gown up, and sign, forms to say, you might not make it, kind of thing. What happens then? What are you doing now, Mark, to sort of try and help with those sort of, before the birth moments where, men are going to this into this as blind as, as a female partner. A lot of the times the mum has maybe talked to their mum, and they've given them some advice, but dads don't really talk to their sons about it, do they? I don't really know. Maybe you could shed some light on that.
I think coming from a government level, I'm all about gender equality. Everyone should be access that support in place, especially in the perinatal period. But in the NICE guidelines, there's no excellent pathway care that includes fathers. And the World Health Organization has nothing on paternal mental health. It has on maternal mums, but nothing on fathers. When we know the high risk of suicide, unfortunately, as well, that people die by suicide during the perinatal period and also afterwards. We only know, look at mums, the Embrace report demonstrates this, but we know a lot of fathers are not screened and assessed for their mental health during this time. And then they get diagnosed with anxiety or depression after the perinatal period, postnatal period, and they don't get the root of the cause. So then we only decide that one child after what happened, and that's not saying it would happen again, unfortunately, but I think those sort of conversations, somebody sat us down as a couple and said, look, we can put this prevention in place for you. Possibly we may have gone on to have more children, but I got a wonderful son. He's 17 now and still learning. But there's a good friend of mine, Scott. He's a prime example, and he shares his own story that Scott was in the armed forces and he's a father of 7, so he's had a lot of experience. But every time, obviously, I said his wife was getting pregnant or having a baby, then his anxiety or depression was actually getting worse, And every time he went back to the GP, they all associated with the PTSD from the armed forces, which, of course, that is a case as well. Some people have more complex PTSD. But then they didn't actually acknowledge the fact that what he witnessed in our labour was his experience as a new dad as well. So we got to educate not just health visitors now and midwives, but actually the workplace, like Kieron said, the sports place, and Jamie was saying, everyone should have this knowledge that fathers can experience struggles during the perinatal period, the antenatal period, as well as and it's preparing dads, because even communication in labour can be traumatic as well. Dads left outside. Even since COVID, we've seen dads sleeping in car parks for 6-7 days because they're afraid to go home just in case they miss the birth of their child as well. So we've seen different pressures in COVID as well, but also there's been benefits on COVID where fathers been on more, and why we needed to change parental leave as well. Paternal leave, for fathers, give them more time, and employers understand that fathers need that space as well, because the outcomes, that 1,001 critical days for the child as well, as far out really outcomes, that's when the baby brain really rewires, and that attachment, secure attachment we need in new children as well. So there's loads of benefits if we invest in the early years and include fathers and be more fathers inclusive in services.
And Jamie, as an employer, and running a big organisation, is that something that that employers think about at the moment? I can't think of any organisations that I particularly know of that, and I might be wrong, that actually give you a little bit of help before the birth of a child, in terms of being an expectant dad as well as being an expectant mum.
Yeah, no, I still think it's a huge gap there, and I think Mark's laying out the case there. I think it shows the huge impact this would have on so many different layers. I mean, I have to say from my own experience with our first child, so my wife had a history of trauma, and we tried to put together a plan in advance and, think things through. And, going back to what you're saying about, can you be prepared for this? I'm very used to being, kind of stating my case, being in positions where you're arguing for things. I find myself completely voiceless during the birth of our first child. To an extent that I was stunned by, but I was overwhelmed by the experience. And that experience, as you said, Mark, of, my wife saying she was going into labour, but because dads weren't allowed in until 11 o'clock, I was kept at the door until that time, even though she was asking for that support. Experiences at that, the first birth where she wasn't listened to, she was saying, I'm in labour, and they were saying, you're a new mum, you're just panicky. It's not true, until they finally checked her and found she was fully dilated and the baby was born, a matter of minutes later. And but as a dad, I think there was no concept on my part of the kind of support and voice and pressure and position that you would need to play as an advocate for your wife who's not in a position to do so at that time. And I would say for me, even now, that still kind of feels a huge source of guilt that I wasn't able to support her at that time. I mean, what I would say was positive. And again, this was primarily focused on my wife as an expectant mother when it came to our second and third child, was that there was a much better support structure in place for her to understand where trauma might play a role within that. And I think that was really helpful for her. But still, as a dad, I think that role you had to play as an advocate when you're going through your own overwhelming emotions, I think was something that wasn't looked at and supported. And I think within workplaces, I mean, it's still very much the case that I think it's a bit of an afterthought. I think we've got better at recognizing some of the impacts. I think we try to, organizations pride themselves where they perhaps accentuate the paternity leave process, but it's still, we're talking matter of weeks rather than, the kind of extensive period that you would see elsewhere. And where we've seen programs around, shared parental leave, I think it still misses the mark massively because, in a lot of cases, it may well be the case that you're in the position of being the main money earner, and so you don't want to share that paternal leave. So I think there's a huge gap there around that support. But also it really struck me, and maybe as an employer myself now, being far more aware of how many exhausted dads there are walking around society. It sounds really dramatic, but every time I get on a plane or a train or now I have a certain understanding of there's, every possibility that, there's a dad in that position, a professional sports person who I can sit at home and slag off the TV about how badly they're playing without taking into account how exhausted they are, or people in many different positions. And I think that gap of understanding the impact that this can have on you, even, nobody relies upon me in my job. There are no lives dependent upon me in my job, but we were joking beforehand that, my son was up most of the night last night. And we don't take that into account. I think there's a huge gap there still to be looked at as employers, but also as wider society in terms of how we develop those support structures.
And that's interesting that you mentioned the pressure on performance there. And Kieron, I'm sure, you must have played a few matches, where you were like, actually, I'm really not on top form, and mostly because I've been dealing with a small person.
Yeah, definitely. And you know what? I look back at my Madeline, my firstborn, and I joined the team literally the week she was born, and the guilt I felt, because I actually started going back to my mother's to sleep before games because I knew that the importance of sleep. I know the importance of recovery and to be in tip-top shape and form, but also the chances of getting injury, being fatigued. So there was a huge guilt element playing in that because I was thinking I need to be there to be the support, but at the same time I need to make sure that I'm performing to the best of my abilities. So I know this dilemma happens with a lot of my friends, and actually, I've heard jokingly people saying that they don't like to recruit new fathers for that reason because of performance. They're thinking that it's essentially a distraction. And that is the thing, again, from being a prepared perspective. I was very, very selfish before I had children, and in the sense that nothing came before my sport, like literally nothing. I always put my sport first for everything. And then your child is there and you see this beautiful little creation, and your whole world changes, and then you're in constant conflict because you just cannot. Why I couldn't, like the fact that I was meant to go back overseas for another year to play professional sport. My wife would come over once a month to visit. I couldn't. I didn't want to be away, and I don't know if it's because my father wasn't my life the same way, that I had this kind of conflict. I don't know if other fathers go through this same dilemma, but I do know that I've had teammates in the past who have been abroad, their child usually in the States, not allowed to go back to see to be there for the birth of the child, and they really struggle, and then you see their performance start to drop. Then you see, but what I'm saying is they're not getting judged on anything else other than how they play that 40 minutes that game. So again, that was the conflict. I knew that, we talk about staff appraisals. We have a staff appraisal every single week. Every performance, every game that you play, that's how you get judged on. Forget what's going on in your life. Forget what's going on in that week. Forget about how you trained or how you've been practicing. You're going to get judged on that game. So with that in the back of your mind, that's where I said I felt the conflict, and I wasn't prepared for how to juggle both. There was no one who was giving me coaching. This is how you manage your time. This is what you're going to have to go through. It was all about how do you perform at your best, and that nothing else mattered.
It's brutal, isn't it? And there was a row on Twitter. I don't know if any of you saw it a week or two ago, where the guy who founded the data company Palantir criticised the US Transport Secretary and called him a loser for taking 6 months paternity leave. So even though some of that is in the past, Kieron, it's still out there, isn't it? You've just got to man up and get on with it, is what they say. And if you show any sign of weakness, you're criticised for it.
Definitely, and actually, I was just reflecting on this yesterday about my experiences, and I was, there was actually a big wow factor because I was thinking I did, a lot of those games were a days. But at the same time, if someone asked me, if you were to take rest, we were going to give you time off, to kind of experience that whole fatherhood and, not worry about, I don't think I would. Like, I think that I am wired that I wanted to get back to work. I wanted to get back on the court. I want to be there for my teammates because that's another family, and you don't want to be letting them down. So I'm very conflicted on actually what would have been a better approach. How would that be managed? Maybe it would be, maybe I missed a training session or two, but you're still getting ready for the games. But I was just thinking about that yesterday, and I was like, what is the answer? And what I think it would be that you would leave it to the player, give him that decision, but without that judgment. Because you're right. It's the same thing as sometimes we would have, voluntary practice sessions, but actually they weren't voluntary because if you didn't show up, you clearly didn't want to work to get better. So that again, it's just that it was quite an interesting take on things because again, it relates to the gig economy. There's a lot of self-employed people out there that they need to get back up and get straight to work, and performance because that's the only way they get paid, and that's what they're getting judged on. So there's a lot of parallels there from not just in sport but in the wider society.
And in the workplace, Jamie and Mark, there's still many dads who do not take their parental leave or take the shared parental leave that's on offer.
No, exactly. I think when you look at Scandinavia and the intake in Scandinavia compared to UK, yeah, definitely. And I think America's, I think it's even massively lower in America, certain countries as well. But I think going back to what Jamie and Kieron just said now as well, I remember as a new father, because I was more like self-employed. I was in sales and marketing then. It was all about commission and all that. And been home for 6 months, no money coming in, and I wasn't the same person when I tried to get back into that job as well. The pressures I could have took before I became a dad, but everything changed in that first year of fatherhood. And the good thing is I didn't go back to that role. I started working in youth work and then mental health in 2006. So it worked out better now for me personally. But I think it's going back to work, and I think there's a cost to that as well. Employers, where we know about that. I think it's the economic cost of people going off work because they poor mental health or struggling, whatever. But how many of them is actually our fathers who have struggled and don't go back to the workplace? So I think there's a big gap in the sporting field as well as the workplace, and where we are starting to see more people educated in with health visitors and midwives, but employers need to know that fathers can struggle for various reasons as well, and sporting clubs like Kieron just said, and Jamie as well. So yeah, it's huge gaps, but I think it's our benefits will come out over the next couple of years, I think, as well, because even the conversation we're having today as well, which is highlighting the fact that there's a massive gap, and if we can invest in this as well, is best. The time management for employers and all sorts of things, the benefits we'll have as well, and they can be more proactive as well in the workplace. So I can relate to what Kieron said of being self-employed as well out in Australia. So yeah, definitely.
And your report, your Father's Reaching Out report, Mark, I think highlighted that something like 1 in 10 dads are at risk of depression during the stage of pregnancy of their partner, let alone after the birth. So how, from your point of view, how did you get through what happened? What were the tools? Was there any support for you? And what's there now?
Yeah, and the 1 in 10 that's the research, but it was 1 in 10 for mums for years. And what happened when we started screening, assessing that, and understanding the mums can suffer from postnatal depression, we know it's anything from 1 in 5 to 1 in 7, depending what from mild, moderate to more severe end. So the 1 in 10, and some of the researchers are saying it's even far higher than that, and it's actually on par with mums, because fathers' behaviour has changed. It's slightly different to mums because they suppress those feelings. So what some of the key factors to look out for in fathers is actually during the pregnancy and the first year of fatherhood and beyond. Obviously, as you change, are you irritable? Are you drinking more? Are you avoiding situations? Are you overworking, underworking, whatever it is? So, this is what we tell the mums as well to say, because relationships have failed, unfortunately, for various reasons, where, dad's not involved for various reasons. But when we ask him about his mental health, he's struggling. He's getting intrusive thoughts, as we know with mums. He can't hold a baby. He's afraid he's going to drop the baby. Confidence. The thing with depression, one of the first things that goes in with depression, sadly, is confidence as well. So it's building up these things and educating people that all parents, people who struggle with IVF and then expect, adoptive parents, all same gender parents, LGBT plus, everyone should have a support in place regardless who they are. So like I said, my work's never about taking attention away from mums. It's all about parents. Get a more holistic approach, if that makes sense.
And you mentioned that sort of touch, that even the touch of the skin and everything is so important for a young baby, and if possible, to get the father really engaged in what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. Because what happens is then, especially if you've got low mood, he's getting reward then. Obviously, we know about the science behind, but also then he gives a massive shift of dopamine. He's really excited now. He's involved, and he's getting a thing. But sometimes unintentionally, like mum say, "Oh, give me the baby. You're too slow, whatever." As long as the baby's safe, it doesn't matter how long it takes for the father. But we've got to encourage that, because sometimes, okay, you going on, but then they don't know the benefits of being a father included. You only got to look at the still face experiment on dads. There's one for mums for years, but there's one on dads. Exactly the same outcome. So if the father is depressed, he's less likely to sing, read, dance, and play, which is so important in those early years as well. So there's other benefits why we should be including fathers as well. But anxiety is far higher, as we know, than depression in fathers as well. So, some of the key factors could be witness, baby loss, father struggling from a previous relationship. Now his current partner, he hasn't told his current partner. Now he's anxious. What is going to happen again? His behavior changes. So we got to look at our behavior changes and never look down on anyone unless you're helping them up, as they say as well. So that's what you're saying. So yeah, look at behavior changes.
And Jamie, have you sort of learned through having the 3 children? Has your anxiety or the way that you behave as a dad and the way you talk to your friends who've become dads changed? Do you find that you kind of are more open to, saying if things are getting a bit tough?
Yes and no. I would say it's definitely a work in progress. Ironically, I'm married to a counsellor, a therapist who specialises, amongst other things, in attachment. No, I mean, I think this is where the chance of bringing together dads to share those experiences is so critical. So we're working just now with staff in NHS Lothian, and there's a great GP over there, Dr. Wahid Mahmood's looking at ideas of bringing, and complementing some of the work that's already over there, Dad's Rock and other groups that are working. I mean, I'm finding this therapeutic today, having this conversation, because to be honest, I don't think I've sat down in this kind of way with friends and spoken about it. I think it's that chance of recognizing that it can be different for different people, and that's okay. I think, as Mark was saying, recognizing some of the warning signs, I think, are critical, because then we have a role to be able to spot those. But also just, I'm very aware that my experience compared to lots of people's, lots of dads, is incredibly privileged. I have a very secure job. I have a nice house. I have a very secure relationship, and compared to lots of challenges that we've even touched on today, I've been very privileged compared to that. But I think actually then sometimes that gives you a role to play as being aware of your own privilege, and therefore hopefully helping to advocate and support others. And I think, the fact that both of Kieron and Mark have touched on that insecurity of kind of gig economy and workplace insecurity, that's a huge issue. And I love the fact that Mark talked about investment, because this is about an investment in society. This is about investment in supporting mums, because mothers will be better supported and outcomes there will be much stronger if other parents are supported as well in that process. But that impact on society, on the economy, on workplaces, and the quality of work is huge. I do a lot of work around the idea of a basic income. And part of that is about addressing economic insecurity. And that insecurity is so powerfully negative in so many different ways. And I think we've touched on that already today, that we need to be addressing this and recognizing it's not a standalone issue. This isn't a nice, and Mark in particular will know better than me, but I get the feeling sometimes from kind of policy circles, this kind of area is seen as a nice add-on. So if we sort the main issues, then it'd be good if we can tick the box on this at some point. The fact it's not in WHO guidelines or nice guidelines is disgraceful. Like, it's absolutely disgraceful that that's the case. It's seen as an add-on, when this is fundamental to supporting both us as individual dads and human beings, but also those wider networks of connectivity. And so I think the more that we can start to see this as a critical part, not taking away from the importance of other areas, but adding to how important we see them as being, and important in its own right. I think it's essential for addressing so many of the wider societal challenges we see around that social contract breakdown that we really need to address, and that COVID has highlighted a lot of those problems. I would argue COVID hasn't really created new problems in society. It's just shown some of those endemic issues that we already face. And I think that, it's so critical that we're starting to find policies for, spaces to bring people together to actually go, it's okay to struggle with this. It's not okay to be left on your own, to not have that support. And I think that's where I certainly am aware, even just from the conversations today, how much more I need to learn and be aware of this to be able to support my own friends and contacts.
And that lockdown, the pandemic, it's meant that a lot of dads, like you say, Mark, have had difficulty being with their partner for birth, but also it's had the reverse, in the sense that dads have been able to spend a lot more time at home, maybe seen the reality of what parenting can be like for certainly for the mum, who maybe traditionally has done more of the looking after the kids. And Kieron, I know that you were sort of saying lockdown's been quite revelatory for you when we were talking before the chat today about becoming more involved with the homeschooling, seeing the pressures that are on there to support your kids, and not being that selfish person that that just went off to work and shut the door behind you.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, we talked about trauma. The mention of homeschooling really triggers me. It was, and I joke about it, but I really did find it extremely difficult. So I went from the father, we just had our second child that year, and daughter starting primary school, young son, and trying to balance work, and okay, everything moved online, but at the same time, it was like I thought I was doing good. I thought I was a good father, but I never realized I wasn't hands-on completely. Now I was, my wife's a nurse. She returned to work after her maternity leave, and then now all of a sudden I am hands-on, and though sometimes I never realised how inadequate I felt. So I was saying with our first child, my wife was very hands-on again, and anytime I tried to help out in certain things, I just felt like I was just messing up. So, as a team player, I knew the things I was really good at. Like I could go and do the supermarket run. I could go and buy the nappies. I could go do this, and I was I was very helpful at those other things. I could help out with this, hold that, lift this, lift that. That's where I kind of fitted in. That was part of our team dynamic. Wife went back to work, and I'm hands-on with two and trying to balance that with work. I was overwhelmed. So I had to find coping strategies. For example, when my wife returned from work, I would go running. I would get out of nature. That was my relief, And again, we talk about guilt. There was the guilt there again that I needed to escape. I needed to get away from this situation. So anytime it was kind of like, okay, I can get out the house, do this, talk to friends. So the two big things I started during lockdown was hill walking with one of my best friends from Stirling, and we just talk about our family, and we talk about life, and we go up in the hills and running, and that was me just getting out and getting that release. And then when I came back home, I was more prepared, more ready. The anxiety kind of dropped, the anger had dropped, because I realised that I was starting to become a lot more shouty. I was triggered a lot more irritable in these situations. So that was how I coped with those things. So the positive was I am now more comfortable now. So say, for example, my wife was going away for a long weekend or whatever, I am very comfortable now in that position. I'm not like, oh no, what am I going to do? You know what I mean? Because I think I was shying away from it for so long. But at the same time, I also know what my releases are. And I think that's for a lot of people, they need to understand that, because that irritability and aggressiveness and anger, that could be unleashed in the wrong ways. And as a male, you do not want to be unleashing that onto your family. You want to find those outlets, and those positive outlets, and again, creating a more positive environment for the household.
Thanks for sharing those, because I was actually just going to come on now to, what advice would you have to men who maybe find that, they're struggling with fatherhood at the moment, and particularly with, the last couple of years. Perhaps Jamie, you could sort of talk, and then we'll come to Mark, because I know Mark, obviously, from a policy point of view, you've been looking at this. But I just wonder, Jamie, have you got any coping strategies that you use when things get a bit stressful? How do you deal with it?
I think Kieron some things up really well there. I mean, for me, I always work from home, so I was kind of used to be here, but I'm used to working from home with not having other people around a lot of the time. And so it was the fact that I also travel a lot, and I can very much empathize with Kieron's talk about the guilt of travel, because actually my role's changed. My life's changed a lot since having kids. In terms of the role I have now is nothing like the role I had, when my first child was born. And I suppose particularly over the last few years, through various reasons, getting a lot more opportunities for international travel, or at least back in the old days when you could travel internationally. And that combination of really enjoying that, but feeling guilty about, leaving my wife, the kids, was a huge aspect to that. I think for me, what I really noticed about the lockdown period is that challenge of not having, as Kieron said, that outlet. You're just there. You were there 24/7. And I was used to sitting on a train for a period of time, or being at meetings, or, having space in the house to myself. And there was nothing there. And that was the case for everyone. Your kids weren't going anywhere. My wife wasn't going anywhere. So we were just there with each other 24/7. And I think certainly my challenge, my risk with that is going back to what you said about that, you have to be stoic. So for me, I think particularly in that first stages of lockdown, I didn't really find any outlets, probably other than, the less positive ones, alcohol and eating badly and so on. I've much like Kieron, but probably less successfully, have tried a wee bit of running and so on, and finding those ways of getting out a bit more. And, and you can feel life is starting to change for me, at least in terms of having a wee bit more out to meetings and so on. But I think, it's that idea of realizing that it doesn't have to be, you don't necessarily have to feel guilty instantly because you need to do something for yourself, because actually, as Kieron said, you're doing it for the good of everyone as well. Now, if that's 24/7 and you're not helping at all, then perhaps you need to find the balance there. But I think my instinctive go-to is, there shouldn't be space for me unless I've made sure that everybody else has had all the space that they need as well, and all the support that they need, and everything else is ticked off. And actually that is counterproductive, because you do end up, irritable. I'm very laid back, and yet the amount of times I can find myself snapping at my kids or getting frustrated with them because you were just running out of steam and energy. And I think it's again, with all the privilege I've talked about in my own life, it's that can impact me as much as anyone else. And I think it's that being able to recognize and go, do you know what, I need 5 minutes. This morning, I joked about my youngest being up all night. My wife and I were awake all night, and this morning I went to get up with them, and I think probably for the first time ever, I actually said to her, do you mind if I get an extra hour in bed and you get up with them just now? Not that she doesn't get up with them normally, but I mean, is my instinct when I did it this morning was, and then I thought, I'm doing this today and I'm off to donate platelets after this. And so I thought, probably actually it would be better for my own health and everybody else's well-being if I took that extra hour in bed. And I think it's just being able to recognize it isn't instantly selfish to look after yourself alongside everyone else. That I know I struggle with, but would probably be where I would try to have that conversation with other dads as well. Because I know talking to friends, it's that challenge of, I'm a dad now, I shouldn't have a social life, I shouldn't go out, I shouldn't do things for myself, and actually no, that's not going to be sustainable. And mum's experienced that as well. It's that balance between the two of you of going, your parents, that's amazing, what a privilege. You're also still human beings who have a number of other things in your life that you need to have, and you need to find that balance with them.
And Mark, you've obviously looked at this in huge detail. Do you sort of agree with what Kieron and Jamie have sort of suggested about that?
Absolutely. I've always been person-centered when it comes to mental health. What works for me might not work for other people. Like I said, same as Kieron said, I walk in a lot. I'm lucky when I'm up in the valleys, that sort of thing. So lockdown went from traveling everywhere, and now all of a sudden you're stuck. And even the things I missed, obviously, the coach my son's football team, at the time for years, and then that shut down. So I had all this space, all this time, and then, starting, playing chess with my wife and getting into chess and all sorts of things. So I learned a lot from lockdown, going back to the more basic stuff, which I enjoyed as well. But I go back, like, I'm person-centered. I always say, like, one of the barriers sometimes stops men from getting the help because they worry about it's going to be on a GP report, it's going to affect the workplace, where, as we know, it's changed a lot. But I say to people, what stopped me, I was working in mental health when I had my really bad struggles afterwards. So when I started working in the hospitals, and those are thinking, well, if it's on my report, I'll never get a job in mental health, which is not true. There's a lot of people working in mental health that actually gone for those experiences. So I think employers need to be aware and to break down these barriers, why men are not getting that early prevention support in place. Because I know only triggers, like Jamie and Kieron just said, I know what I'm overwhelmed now more, but certainly when I went for that depression, I didn't know what was going on, because I think I'm from a culture where my father was a miner, my grandfather was miners, cousins, or everyone work, and it was a case, if we had a problem, let's go to the pub, let's go and have a pint. Whereas the conversation with my son now is very much, he knows my wife works in mental health as well, and I work in mental health. We talk about emotional well-being, or the positive stuff. So, he's more likely to come on to me if he's struggling now as well. So I think some of the things I've taken out from my own father and grandfather, there was no conversation about mental health. So we've addressed that. So my son now is more likely to be talking about mental health to his children, and break the ripple effect, break the stigma.
And very quickly, Mark, I mean, if somebody is genuinely struggling at the moment, they've been listening to the conversation and hopefully they've picked up some really good tips and advice during the conversation. But, if they're worried about, going to see, a health specialist or whatever, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I always say the quicker the help, the quicker recovery, really. But, GPs actually are the first port of call. But then, if you don't get that support or you want more specialist help, it's different. I know in Wales, we've got community mental health teams, so you can access community mental health teams. Obviously, England, IAP services, and Scotland get different pathways as well. But it's just keep on going, make sure you speak to somebody that specialises in it as well. But also the benefits of talking to other people like we are today as well. I think even walk and talk groups are shooting up everywhere, anti-man's clubs, those sorts of social prescribing, they call it, so these, especially for the mild end. But if somebody's make a plan to take their lives, then obviously, you need to look at the NHS mental health helplines, and obviously, that's very important that you access that support in place. And like you said, I come from Bridgend, where unfortunately there was a lot of young suicides in Bridgend. That's the reason why I got into mental health years later. It affects communities as well when people unfortunately die through suicide as well. So, don't be embarrassed, get the help. Don't worry what other people think, because that's some of the barriers. I've never had any bad comments now from opening up about mental health, especially my community. It's been great. So don't struggle, because if you were supported and helped, then how could the old oxygen mask on the aeroplane, who do you put on first, yourself or the baby? You put it on yourself, because then you can look after the baby better. So get the help, guys. Don't struggle in silence. Don't suffer in silence.
That's lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. We've just got a question that come in just so that we can wrap up the conversation, because I'm aware that time is ticking on, and thank you so much for your contributions today. Nick has asked, how do you open up a conversation with teenage sons without being too direct? That's Mark, that's one for you, I guess.
Oh gosh, going for adolescence, that's a challenge in itself, But I basically just talk about. I think my son, I was pretty lucky because obviously he's seen the journey we go through, and because we worried about school, I was going to impact in the school, but he's never had anyone come on to him. I think, but having a conversation, like I said, I talk about with young people as well, where we all got mental health. I struggle. There's loads of things. Sorry, I'm going off on tangent. Like, stress monsters for young people, put their problems in. With teenage sons, obviously there's different challenges because their moods, going for that thing. But I just have a conversation like I'm talking to you today, and sometimes they take it on board. My son takes it on board, and then he digests it, and he comes back to me. Then he said, "Yeah, Dad, And if I'm wrong as a parent, I want him to tell me I'm wrong as well, because we're not always right as parents as well. So it's just having an open conversation. But it depends on your son as well. My son is he can be a big he's brilliant. I love my son a bit, but sometimes it takes a bit longer to for him to grasp certain things in a way. I'll take it back. I'm going off. Sorry, guys, I'm going off on tangent. Sometimes he's coming out to that end. I think that moodiness.
Yeah, I've got 3 teenage boys, and I can only speak from what I found that helps is actually having a conversation in the car when you're not actually looking at each other. So it's just a conversation that opens up, and you don't have to ask those awkward questions, but they'll possibly start talking as long as they haven't got their headphones on and ignoring you completely. But I've always found that helps, because you're not looking them in the eye. I don't know if anybody else feels that way.
Do you know, I'll tell us really quickly that is, I wish I thought said that, because when I take my son to watch Cardiff, the football and stuff, those are the conversations we have in the car. So absolutely, that's one definitely way.
I know I don't have a teenage son, but some of the advice I was given when just working with teenagers is don't be scared to talk about your own vulnerabilities. So actually open up about certain things. So if you're willing and being a little bit more direct in the sense that you can actually share your own vulnerabilities, become more comfortable sharing your own vulnerabilities, then it allows to create an environment that people are a lot more open. And I think that can make a huge difference in society.
Yeah, telling them you're having a bad day, and the reason why is not a bad thing, is it?
I think, as Mark said, not trying to pretend that we have all the answers and we're right all the time, and that they can call us out, and we won't necessarily agree when they do call us out. But also, I think for me, and again, my oldest is 12, so he's just starting to hit that period, and I think something around the consistency and the frequency of the conversations. So it's like the old stereotype about, the sex chat where you have it once, and everyone's embarrassed and then you never talk about it again. I think if it's something that's regularly there, you can allow, they can think about stuff, go away and come back again. It's not like we've done it as a one-off. So I think having that I would say as early as you can, so that they know they can come back to you and explore that with you, I think is critical. And And also, you know, and I trained as a teacher, and one of the things I learned very quickly was to not pretend that I knew an answer to something if I didn't. So being able to say, look, do you know what? I don't know about that. I need to think about it, or I need to go away and look into it. You know, and I think, again, for me, resources like today, I would, you know, happily sit down with my son and suggest he watch this to pick up on those kind of experiences and the work that the others have done. So yeah, I think that consistency and openness is critical.
And just continuing the conversation is that same old phrase, isn't it? Ask the question twice. You know, don't just ask once, ask twice. Ask it in a different way. It doesn't have to be an obvious question, but you know, there will come an opportunity that they do open up, hopefully. And Nick, thank you very much for that question. Emily, I don't know if our producer Emily has got any more questions for us at the moment. I think that's the main one that's come through. So I'd just like to say thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today, and to Jamie and Kieron and Mark for your advice and expertise. It's been a delight to talk to you. Really interesting conversation, and I hope it's helped everybody who's tuned in. Our three guests are very, very busy themselves. They're all disappearing off to do the rest of their work today. So Kieron's on Sky Sports tonight. Kieron, is that right? Co-commentating on your old club, Glasgow Rocks.
I will be on Sky tonight.
Yeah, good.
7.
Good, excellent. 7 o'clock, so you can catch Kieron there. Mark is in Leeds, as we said earlier. It's the premiere of his film, the film that's been made of his book, Daddy's Blues, and that takes you to Holbeck Club, I believe, at 6 o'clock, Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, anyone can come as well if you're in the area as well. You know, just so yeah, that's great.
Just pop along if you're in Leeds and you want to join that conversation and see the film tonight, and we'll put the links to the film out for you later as well. And Jamie's continuing his work campaigning for a basic income, and you've got an event next week, Jamie, on Monday. If you search for Scottish Attachment in Action on Eventbrite, Jamie will be busy being a panelist on another conversation on Monday. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and again, very welcome to have as many people join us. I think that role of attachment, as we talked about, so critical in so many of these areas. I'm also very happy to connect with anyone through you know, contact details or Twitter or anything. So
brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. And for those of you who've tuned in and want more general information on mental health and a whole range of other life issues, do please visit our freely available hub, championcinema.com, where there are hundreds of videos of people sharing their own life experiences and stories to help you out. If you search for fatherhood or men's mental health, we've added a lot of the resources that we've talked about today that you might find useful, including Mark's report, and we'll put the link to his film there. And if you'd like to know more about us, and what we do at Frog Systems, you can visit our website. You can see that on the screen. You can drop us an email, and you can follow us on social media. We've recorded the conversation today, and we'll share that the link to this on our social media channels as soon as it's available. So thank you to my guests, and thank you everybody once again, and do enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thanks everyone. Look after yourselves.
Bye.
Bye.